Himself said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. See what we are separating ourselves from, and what we attach ourselves to through lies. Clearly, the devil. Therefore, if we really want to be saved, we're obliged to love the truth with all our strength and concern, guarding ourselves from all falsehood, so that we are not separated from truth and from life. Boy, this paragraph is packed. I think we could spend half of our time just looking at the different points that he touches on here. But the very first one I want to mention, because we're not going to spend half of our time on it, is this wonderful thing that applies very well throughout all of our life. He says, what? Why are they easily led astray into lying? The answer, I see that you are not careful about holding your tongue. Boy, how many problems could we prevent if we took that to heart? Not just about lies, but in so many different areas of our life. If we learn to close our mouths, we would avoid so much trouble, right? So much trouble with our family, with our loved ones, with our spouse, or, with our boss, maybe, if we really get deep into it. That inability to control the tongue. St. James talks about the tongue in his epistle in the New Testament, right? And talks about the difficulty and how much trouble is caused by this little tiny muscle in our mouth, and yet it brings such great evil to us. Well, here we see he's pointing out that it leads us into lying. If we kept our mouths closed, we're more easily prepared to keep from speaking falsehood. When we let our mouths run, it's very easy, because we're used to saying many idle and useless things, to then want to talk ourselves out of that situation. And that can often involve, rather than accepting responsibility, because that would maybe put us to shame a little bit and cause us to become silent, we find ways to justify ourselves, to tell lies, to get out of these situations. So, and I just thought that was a wonderful, wonderful point to begin with, because I was listening to a homily recently on noetic prayer by Yevenda Frem. He's talking about the teachings of Elder Joseph the Hesychist. And he said that was one of the main things that Elder Joseph the Hesychist stressed, that you needed to learn to hold your tongue, basically, to keep silence if you wanted to make progress in prayer. So on the one hand, not only does keeping silence and controlling our tongue preserve us from these vices, like lying, right, or anger, or swearing, or all these nasty things that can tend to come out of our mouths, but it also is a means for cultivating virtue, because then with that stillness, we're able to cultivate prayer, right? And so it's a wonderful thing, I think, to begin with. And really, if we're going to take anything to heart tonight, let's take that to heart. Let's walk away and say, okay, on lies, keep my mouth closed more often, and I'll cut down on the amount of lying that I'm tempted to fall into. It's an easy solution, right? But he goes on and he says a few other things that I think are very sort of profound. For example, that God is the truth, that Christ is the truth, and that when we lie, what are we doing? We're actually uniting ourselves to the father of lies. We're distancing ourselves from God automatically with our lying. Even in our little lies, we put a wedge between us and God, because God is truth. God is light, right? He's the removal of darkness. And when we put that falsehood in there, we put an obstacle, and we do damage. We wound our hearts, and we can create habits that are very destructive. But I think oftentimes we can think, well, lying isn't that big of a deal? It's like adultery. Yeah, I get it. Fornication, sure. I get these ones. Murder, of course. These are the big ones, right? Maybe even being greedy. But it's like, well, lying, it's like, I suppose. But what does he say? I mean, right in the first line, no one who lies becomes united to God. Meaning, it's impossible to achieve the goal of human existence, which is union with God, transformation. if we become liars. Boy, I mean, it's just such a wake-up call, because it's so easy to fall into that, I think, from the small ones to the big ones. And he makes that point again, right, that I've talked about in other lessons where, how does he put it in this one? Anyway, the point being that, it's in these little things that we'll head towards God, and it's in these little things that we're going to head away from God. And so we need to take those things seriously, even these little things. So he goes on to say, there are three different kinds of lie. And this is why it's so helpful when we read the Holy Fathers, because they really examine these topics. They get right down to it, right? When we hear lying, we just think, well, lying. Okay, sure. We all understand what that means, more or less. But they really dig deep into it and give us all of the various sides. And why that's so helpful is because then we can know what to look for, right? And we don't end up lying to ourselves or becoming deceived, as it were, because we understand, oh, I got to pay attention for this and for that. And so he says there's lying in thinking, there's lying verbally, and there's lying through one's way of life. And the interesting thing, he begins by talking about lying in thinking. And I think that's the one that's most connected in some ways to our talk before about resentment. Because what happens when we lie in our thinking, we sort of we lie to ourselves. We're not honest, completely honest. That's when we hold on to these old resentments and things like that. They're buried deep within us, and we're not having the sort of full awareness of it. But he says that, and this is very sort of significant, the person who lies in his thinking is the person who is open to suspicion. Oh, well, that's a connection that we wouldn't maybe necessarily have thought. That if we're a suspicious person, right, that what's going on is lying in our thinking. And so he says, this person, when he sees someone talking with his brother, he's suspicious and says, they're talking about me, right? I mean, do we recognize this? Think about maybe, maybe in our work lives, but I can sort of think back to, high school or junior high or whatever, and you walk by and the group's talking and they suddenly go silent, and you're like, oh, what am I, something on me? What's going on here? Or they start whispering when you go by. This is sort of something we can imagine, right? And he's saying this kind of thinking, where we are constantly assuming that people are talking about us, or we fall into that temptation where that they're judging us, that they have thoughts about us. He says it's a form of lying to ourselves, lying in our own understanding. And it's very destructive. The thing that I couldn't help but think about at the same time is also its connection to the sort of egotism that's present in that. The person who's always concerned and always suspicious that people are talking about them and worrying about them and thinking about them really has a high opinion of themselves. I mean, when we fall into that kind of thinking, boy, we're really putting ourselves at the center of the universe, aren't we? To think, I'm so important that other people have nothing better to do than to talk about me, whether good or bad. And it's a good sort of reality check in that way too. If we're falling into this kind of being suspicious all the time, we need to ask ourselves, am I being a little bit self-centered? Am I being a little bit egotistical? That's just my own sort of side thought. But he says that when a person falls into this, he says, if someone says one word to him, he suspects that he said it intentionally to bother him. Simply, he is suspicious of his neighbor in everything, saying, he did that because of me. He said that or did that because of me. This is the person who lies in his understanding. Nothing he says is true, but all is based on suspicion. And so he's connecting here our basically judging situations, judging other people, and imagining the kinds of things that are going on here. He's connecting that with lying, which I don't think is a connection that most of us would think of most of the time. But what he's saying is you're lying to yourself. To be putting that much focus on thinking about what other people are saying about you and imagining all of the possibilities. right? You're creating a long list of the things, whether good or bad for that matter, right? And you're putting yourself again at the center of the universe. He did this because of me. He did that or this or that because of me, right? Because I'm so important. You know, something to definitely watch out for, especially because he says from this kind of suspicion, we have all these other problems that happen. Curiosity in the real negative sense, right? We're always looking into things, trying to figure it out, what's going on. Slander, right? Which is when we start to speak bad about other people. Oh, I know this person was talking about me, so I'm going to talk about them to somebody else, right? And falling into that kind of temptation. Eavesdropping. It's like when I have better things that I ought to be doing, I spend time spying on people, you know, and it goes further than that. I start to resent them. I start, as he says, quarreling and condemning them. Why? Because I think they're doing negative things against me. So every little action that they do, I always interpret it in the negative. And as a result of that, I start to have all of these problems. I'm always agitated when I see that person. I'm always upset. I'm tempted to sort of lash out because I think that they're thinking things about me, or to be dismissive, or whatever the situation might be. And so, we really want to sort of pay attention to that lying in our understanding, lying in our thinking. Now he says, here's where it turns. It sometimes happens that he suspects something and it turns out to be true. And on account of this, he maintains that he wants to correct himself. So that's why he's always curious and thinking that if someone speaks against me, I'll see what is the mistake he's accusing me of. I'll hear the bad things that they're saying so that I can correct myself. I'm not doing it to be, for negative reasons. But he says this can't bring any success in the spiritual life. It can't help but fail. Why? Because he says it begins in lies. It begins in this judging what people are saying, this fantasizing about all the things that people are saying about us. And he says for that reason, it's not helpful. He says the better thing to do is, if we really want to be corrected, when someone says something to us, when someone corrects us, we should say, forgive me, I'm sorry. Or we should correct our behavior. We should thank the person. This is the person who really wants to be corrected. And he's pointing out that that isn't the case when we lie to ourselves to say, let's be curious, let's practice suspicion, because we're going to make ourselves better people. There's lots of ways to make ourselves better people without having to indulge in this lying in our understanding, in our thinking. He tells this, he goes on to tell two sort of wonderful stories, actually. Before I leave that, I should also point out, if we really do want to be corrected, the Abba says, don't worry. He says, if God sees that this is his intention to be corrected, he will never leave him. He will never leave us in error, but will always send him a person who can correct him. Okay? So we don't have to worry about trusting our suspicions, thinking, well, it's the only way I can correct myself. If we're faithful to God and we really want to be corrected, God will send us a guide. He will send us a book. He'll send us an opportunity that we can hear a word so that we can correct ourselves. We don't have to indulge in these sort of negative things. And he goes on to tell two stories. One where basically he was judging someone, trusting his suspicions and his thoughts, and judged a person to be a certain way. And he said after he got advice from his spiritual father, he never did that again. The next one, though, he said, I knew of a brother in the monastery. And he said this brother had been so completely overcome by this passion of lying and suspicion that what happened? It's an amazing story, right? Because we say seeing is believing, right? We all know this phrase, seeing is believing. Yes, seeing may be believing, but what exactly we are to believe from that seeing isn't always straightforward. So what do I mean by that? He says, there we had a brother, much troubled by this passion. He was so easily persuaded by his own suspicions that he was certain that all of his suspicions were just as his thoughts dictated to him, and it could not possibly be otherwise. As time passed, the evil progressed, and the devil had misled him so much that once he went into the garden to spy. He always eavesdropped in pride. He thought he saw one of the brothers stealing figs and eating them. It was Friday, not yet the second hour, meaning they were keeping a fast. And having persuaded himself that what he saw was a reality, he left in silence and watched again during the Eucharistic gathering to see what the same brother would do about Holy Communion. When he saw the brother washing his hands to enter and take communion, he ran and said to the abbot, "Look at that brother who is going to take communion with the other brothers. Order that it not be given to him. I saw him stealing figs from the garden this morning and eating them." Meanwhile, this brother entered into the holy offering with great compunction. He was one of the devout. When the Abba saw him, he called him before he reached the priest who was distributing Holy Communion. He took him aside and said to him, "Tell me, brother, what have you done today?" The brother was surprised and said, "Where, master?" And the Abba said, "In the garden when you went there this morning. What did you do there?" The surprised brother said again to him, "Father, I was neither in the garden nor indeed in the monastery this morning, for I have only just come back from the road. Immediately after the dismissal of the vigil, the steward sent me on an errand far away." The errand that he referred to was many miles away, and he arrived just in time for the Eucharist. The Abba called the steward and asked him, "Where did you send this brother?" He confirmed what the brother had already said, namely, that he sent him to that particular town. He made a bow to the Abba, saying, "Forgive me, Father, for not sending him to get your blessing. It was after the vigil and you were resting." When the Abba heard all this, he gave them both his blessing and allowed them to take communion. But what did he do? Then he called the other brother, who had the suspicions, and reprimanded him, banning him from Holy Communion. Not only that, but he gathered together all the brothers after the service and told them what had happened in tears. He marked out that brother in front of everyone. He had 3 reasons for doing so. Firstly, to shame the devil and make an example of the sower of suspicion. Secondly, to allow the brother's sin to be forgiven through this dishonor and to obtain God's help for his advancement. And thirdly, to ensure that the brothers never trusted their own suspicions. He gave much advice about this to us and to the brother concerned, saying that there is nothing more harmful than suspicion, and he proved that by this incident. So back to what I said in the beginning, yes, seeing is believing, but sometimes we can't trust what we've seen. In this case, well, it's hard to say. Did the brother just mistakenly think he saw someone in the garden, or did the devil appear and trick this monk and cause, in order to cause this kind of turmoil to happen? And so we have to be extremely careful. This is an example in the Abba's own life, in the monastery that he lived in firsthand. This isn't him telling about a miracle that he once heard about a brother who saw someone who really wasn't there. He's recording it. He was in the monastery, right? To use this as a witness to say, listen, if we fall into sin like this, if we continually perpetuate this habit, we better be careful, because in a case like this, even the devil can show up to continue to perpetuate our suspicions, even allowing us to see things that manifestly weren't there, right? This is what happens when we lie in our thinking. We start seeing things at the prompting of the devil that aren't there. And I don't necessarily mean visually see them. We start reading all of people's actions and motions, and they rolled their eyes, or they let out a sigh this particular way, or they turned their back to me. And we start reading everything in this context of what it really meant. And you can see how destructive that is. Before we move on, though, I just wanted to point out, why did the abbot shame this poor monk in front of the whole community? I mean, can you imagine this happens? This happens in your church, and the priest, after the liturgy, comes out in front of the whole community and says, such and such a person thought this, saw this, da-da-da, and this happened. I mean, can you imagine? What would be the response from most people? Unfortunately, probably they would never come back to church ever again. And not only would they not come back, they would be just insane with anger, right? Now, this is part of the difference between obviously a monastery, which is much more like a family, but the point of why he did it, I think, was just is sort of wonderful. On the one hand, he calls it out. So it's very clear. Look at the kind of delusion we can fall into. But the second reason, I think, is really so insightful and shows his spiritual discernment. Why did he do it? He shamed the brother in public in front of all of the other monks. Why? So that the other monks wouldn't be tempted to hold resentment about that. It was a way of allowing the brother to feel this moment of shame, everyone also acknowledging, yes, this was a moment of shame, and not only not holding resentment, but they probably felt bad for him, thinking, oh, that could have been me, or look what could have happened. And so the wisdom of the spiritual father here is that it probably actually allowed compassion to come from the rest of the monks, who otherwise may have been tempted to hold on to resentment for this sort of particular situation. So I thought it was just a wonderful way to sort of also show that things that sometimes seem harsh, actually may be the means for actually healing a person and stopping the situation before it gets worse. So a little bit off, but I just thought it was worth drawing our attention to. So now he goes on and he talks about the second kind of lying. So he did lying in thinking, very much tied to suspicion. But we also have lying in words. And he says, this is the person who, let us say, is too lazy to get up for vigil or to go to church, we could say, yet does not say, forgive me, because I was too lazy to get up. Instead, he says, I had a fever, I was faint, I couldn't get up, I didn't have the strength, I had a busy week at work, I had too much homework to do, I have, people visiting, my in-laws were visiting, and I couldn't, okay? Rather than just saying, forgive me, blaming ourselves, as he says 10 lying words to avoid making a bow and humbling himself. If someone blames him for something, he sighs and tries to change his words in such a way so as to refute the person who blames him. Oh, that's not what I meant. What I really did was this and this. And rather just accepting with humility and saying, forgive me, I didn't do well with that. Right? It's this temptation for us to find a way out of the situation. And yeah, we might feel bad about it afterwards. And yes, we might bring it to confession. But the goal is to not fall into that in the first place, right? Like to be able to accept a little bit of this humbling in those cases, to try to cultivate an attitude of honesty, and where our first word out of our mouth isn't always an excuse. I know it's very difficult. I mean, in my case anyway, it's difficult, right? To not say, oh, well, this is why I didn't do this, or rather than just saying, you know what, you're right, I'm sorry about that, and, doing better next time, or then elaborating after the fact. But we usually want to begin with the excuse and then roundabout get to, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't do this. Right? We want to avoid that as much as possible because it's very easy to fall into this lying in words when we do that, right? Even if we don't mean to, because we start piling up the words. But he says the worst one is when we have the person who, if he happens to want something, right? He does not come to the point and say, I like this, I want it. But he persists and says in a roundabout way, oh, I suffer this, I need this, or they told me to do that, and many other lies so as to fulfill their will, right? Anything you can do to kind of get your will, oh, I need this, oh, my back hurts, oh, that's a nice chair you had, my back's terrible, you think we could switch? Or whatever. But this temptation, and basically what it is that he's describing here is when we manipulate people to get the things that we want, right? Very careful. We have to be very careful with manipulation, right? It is a form of lying. It has a lot of problems with it, and it can be, it can be a temptation, right? Because there's a fine line between dealing with people in a way that minimizes problems and maximizes, everyone getting along, and manipulating difficult people, for example, to get the things that we want, right? For example, flattery. Boy, we all know how flattery works, right? And how that can really we talk about buttering people up and stuff. but we have to be careful not to fall into those things. Don't flatter people, compliment people. And when we say these things, mean it from our heart, right? Don't do it because we want something to come out of it for ourselves, right? Do it because it's the right thing to do, or it's a nice thing to say. And begin to evaluate our motivations, right? Am I lying in my words, or am I just, giving glory to something that's beautiful, or to a person for a job well done, right? And that's a fine balance, and it can be difficult, and that's why we have to be evaluating ourselves as we do this, to make sure we're not falling into flattery and manipulation because we have desires and we want to fulfill our will, not because we care about the person themselves and the good work that they've maybe done. He says every sin arises from the desire for pleasure, avarice, meaning we want things, right? Greedy, or ambition. He says lying has roots in 3 vices. So if we kind of take this to heart, hopefully we can watch ourselves. Either from not blaming and humiliating ourselves, meaning we don't want to be in a situation where we look bad, so we do everything in the world we can to avoid looking bad, right? Whether that means lying, whether that means manipulating, whether that means whatever, right? That's the first root of lying, is because we don't want to look bad. We don't want to be humble, right? We don't want to blame ourselves and accept responsibility. It's difficult in our world, right? Because there's certain situations where you always have to present yourself as the best. You're always the most competent, right? You're the one that deserves this job because you're better than everyone else in the world, right? This is the thinking of the world. And in a certain degree, we do have to kind of play that game as we interact in the world. But we have to be very careful how we do it, and to minimize the impact as much as possible, and as much as possible to avoid it altogether, by adopting a humble attitude. He says the other reason why we fall into lying, the other root of it, is a desire for pleasure. We want the things that we want. And so as a result, it's easy to lie. That can be a temptation, right? I want my boss off my back. So I'll say, yes, I finished the assignment. I did all the stuff, even if I didn't. Or, yes, I've been working at this hard all day. I'll get right to it, right? I've been working hard at this all week. Sorry. I'll get it to you the next day. When in reality, we weren't doing anything like that, right? It's just a way of getting them off of our back. It's satisfying this pleasure for us. And there's other ways that we do it. And he says the third root is for gain. We do it because we want to manipulate the situation, as we were saying about manipulation, to get something good for ourselves, right? And these are usually the motivations. And so if we're careful and we watch for the motivations, we can keep it from happening. We can stop the problem before it starts, right? But that takes a little bit of practice. We're not going to be perfect at it. But we have to start asking ourselves in situations, why am I doing this? Why am I saying this? Or why do I want to go speak to this person about this, right? And being careful of how we deal with the situations. When we don't do so well, pick ourselves back up again, and kind of keep going. He then goes on to talk about, before he talks about the third kind of lying in life, he makes this sort of digression where he talks about what we would call a white lie. And I found this very sort of interesting in Abba Dorotheos. I encountered this particular passage many, many years ago. And when I was first reading sort of Orthodox books and that kind of stuff. And this really stood out to me because in our culture, we either sort of fluctuate between one of two things, that lying really isn't a big deal, or we take the opposite stance, a very kind of legalistic kind of way, right? Never lie, never lying is always bad. And again, the wisdom of the fathers of our church is to say, yes, lying is always bad, but it doesn't mean that there aren't certain situations where a white lie may actually help the situation better and cause less damage than otherwise would happen in this particular situation. And again, that's because rules need to be applied in context. Now, in the case of, most virtues and vices, they're usually pretty clear cut in the sense that there are always certain actions that will transgress them. But then there's a whole lot of gray areas. For example, what is a courageous act and what is a foolish act, right? And the balance of that oftentimes will depend on the context and the situation, right? And so we have to sort of see lying in that case. The example that he gives is you have this person who apparently killed someone, and he arrives on your doorstep and you take him in, and the magistrates are showing up, and if you deliver this person over, he's going to be put to death immediately, or like no chance of a trial kind of thing. And he says in that case it may be better to say, no, I haven't seen this person, and speak to them so that they have the opportunity for repentance, rather than just delivering them over in a situation, for example, where they would immediately be put to death with no chance of sort of reparation for what had happened. There's examples of this kind of stuff. That one's a particularly difficult one, because in our context it doesn't make a lot of sense, because we have a justice system that follows sort of clear rules and that kind of stuff. We don't have to really worry about people, not to the same degree. There's much more of a process, right? So we're not delivering people over to death necessarily. We're delivering them over to be tried, right? And to sort of see what happens. But a modern example, I knew of a story of a young carpenter. I think he was a carpenter, and he was doing work for one of the monasteries. And he was pretty fresh out of the out of school, and he was trying to help the monastery and do this. And he was removing a tree or a tree branch or something, and by accident he didn't notice a power line, and it came down on the line and caused all these problems. And the advice of the abbot at the monastery was, well, we'll say that this happened, and not that this person wasn't sort of paying attention. There was more of putting it more as an accident, which it indeed was. But the problem was with this new carpenter, that he was going to probably, well, almost certainly lose his license immediately for that having happened. And so in that particular case where it was an accident, he wasn't directly overseeing it. There was some discernment applied, because the rule was going to ruin this young novice carpenter's whole career, right? No one got hurt. It was a bad situation. He learned from his mistake. Okay, we have to be careful to do this. It depends heavily on context. And as he says, we should never do it lightly. Mostly we shouldn't do it at all. And he says when we do, I'll read it for you exactly. He says, even in this case where there is a great necessity, a person must not be without care, but he must repent in tears before God. So even in a situation like that, the level of repentance that's being asked from us in a situation where maybe this was the right thing to do, or the lesser of two evils is what we might say, that even in that situation we're not free of guilt, and we have to offer this to God and beg God that we did the right thing, that we made the right decision, and come to him in tears, even as it says, right? And consider it as a time of temptation, that we were visited with this temptation, that we had to make this hard choice. We're not sure that if we made the right decision. He said, we must not use this very often, but as one possibility amongst many others. It's like an antidote for poison, or like the purgative, which if taken continuously is harmful, but if taken once a year when it is necessary is beneficial. One must face the peculiar situation in a similar way, so that if it is necessary, as I said, to adapt the truth, to make that one occasion among a great many, and only when it is necessary. I know in the life of, I think it was Saint Porphyrius, there's an example where when he first goes to Mount Athos, I don't know if you're familiar with his life from Wounded by Love, he wants to go to Athos. He's very young still at this point. too young to go to Athos. He's only 12 years old or something. And what does one of the monks do? Seeing his zeal, seeing, and recognizing it as from God. This was a sort of an experienced elder. When they were on the boat and they were going to enter onto Athos, he said, "This is my nephew, and he's coming to live with us. He has to come live with me." And it was an example, basically of a lie, right? But part of the commentary on that is recognizing that it wasn't a lie for the monk's benefit. And this is the difference we also have to make. We're not talking about lying here, even white lies, to make our life easier. We're not talking about white lies to make our life better. We're talking about, like this case, where he lied for the sake of the young boy, but not for his own sake, but for the young boy's sake, right? Because in that particular instance, the straight law, which is no one under 12 years old should come to be, to be here. It didn't apply well to that situation. And that was the same thing with the carpenter, was that in the particular situation, the law didn't apply well to all the given circumstances that had actually happened. And this is the kind of thing we're kind of weighing up, but never for our good, never because it's going to make our life easier. And even when it happens, it's a temptation, and we have to repent to God in tears for it. So just as a sort of a side note, because sometimes we see ourselves in that situation, right? Sometimes we feel you've been asked, "How does this look?" And it looks terrible. What are you going to say? Actually, it looks awful. You're a slob. You can't do that, right? So you have to find a way of adapting the truth, as it were, which means maybe you don't directly lie and say, "Oh, I like it," but you might find something that you do like. I like that color. I like that cut on you. Right, there's some way that you can be complimentary without having to outright lie. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about adapting the truth. We want to kind of avoid those situations as much as possible. The final one, the liar in his whole life. This is a great temptation, I would say, for us as Orthodox Christians who want to live our faith and live a spiritual life. And basically what he's saying here, this is the person who, while in reality is dissolute, doesn't have virtue, pretends that they're temperate, that they are virtuous. This is the person that, while they're greedy, they talk a lot about charity, right? And praises, sympathy. This is the proud person who outwardly admires humility. Basically, he's describing a hypocrite, right? The reason why I say this is a temptation for us is because, at least going by my own life, to a certain degree, I'm a hypocrite. I stand here before you. I read these wonderful words of the Holy Fathers. I exhort you, as I'm exhorting myself, to not do these things. And yet, what do? As St. Paul said, the good that I would do, I don't do. And the evil that I wouldn't do, that I do. Right? And this is the situation we find ourselves in, especially because we're not yet purified. The situation of we're mildly hypocrites, and this is what we're trying to rectify in our whole life. We're trying to transform ourselves, right? But we want to, as much as possible, avoid it in the intentional sense, right? Where we play up that we're very virtuous, right? Where we play up all of these things, and when really we don't have a humble attitude at all, right? We want to, again, walk this line, right? It's a difficult line to walk, I think, for us. It's not wrong to praise virtue. It's not wrong to say, I want to be like this, even though I know I'm not, right? That's why we talk about the church as a hospital. Don't be scandalized when you go to the church and you find people who seem miserable and hateful and gossips and judging people and doing all of these things. Who else would be there but people like that who are trying to become healthy? And if we acknowledge the reality, many times those people, if not all the time, are us, right? To differing degrees. We live this hypocrisy. We live this lying in our whole life. But The difference that he's speaking about is a person who embraces that lie, who doesn't want to be changed, who doesn't want to struggle, who wants to seem to be something rather than to be that thing. Okay? And I would like to say, hopefully for all of us at least, that's not the case. Right? That we're not happy not becoming the people God wants us to be. So that would be the sort of last one I would warn us about, this lying in our whole life. And he says this, he says we should expect this kind of lies where something looks really, really good, but inside is actually rotten. Because he says this is the only way we can mislead people. And he says this is how the devil misleads people. He transforms himself what? Not into some ugly beast and then says, follow me. He transforms himself, as St. Paul says, into an angel of light. And then tries to, woo you over to him and to his worship. Because he's the father of what? He's the father of lies, right? He enjoys presenting a false image of himself and having people fall and stumble into that. So we ought to do our best not to imitate that, but to imitate a life of truth as much as possible in our thinking, in our words, and in our life, so that we can be united to God, transformed with Christ, who is this truth, who is this way, who is this life. So I'll stop there. If you have any questions, I would be happy to entertain them as best I can.
Thank you, Father. I have two questions, if it's okay.
Certainly.
The first one is, what about calling in sick in order to attend church on a major feast day or something? I do it all the time.
Well,
I mean, I'm blessed enough to have St. Cosmas Monastery as my parish. I'm very close. So every year on Yorondisa's name day, I'll either call in sick or say I have a doctor's appointment or something like that so I can be there.
Right. What I would say, I'd have to know more about your situation. What I would say is talk to your spiritual father about it. But by way of general advice, what I would say is, am I using my vacation time so that I can have the time off to go to these feasts? Am I picking up extra shifts from other people and trying to change shifts so that I can be available on these days to go to these feasts? Am I doing everything that I can to inconvenience myself for the sake of achieving this goal? Or is my go-to option, well, I'm just going to call in sick? Or, well, I'm just going to say this lie, right? And this is what we definitely want to avoid. And I'm sort of saying this as a general principle. If we've gone through all of those stages and we still can't get out of this situation, then speak to your spiritual father. But for the reality is, most of us don't plan our lives, our vacation lives, our free time around the church services, right? And the only time that there's a conflict is when it's to do with my work time is in conflict with my church time, right? How many people take off? People say, oh, I can't go to church during Holy Week, I work. I can't go to church during Bright Week, I work. How many people take those 2 weeks off for their vacation? How many people take a week off during Holy Week for vacation? Don't we all have, we don't all have, but don't many of us have many weeks of vacation? So we don't take off the time before the feast. We only take off the time after the feast, maybe, right? And we need to begin to change our thinking about these things. We have to examine why and what our motivations are. That's what my answer is. But you'd have to speak to your spiritual father, because I don't know the ins and outs of your particular situation.
Okay, this might be a very stupid question, but my next question is, how about all the thousands of parents over so many generations who have taught their kids about Santa Claus?
Yeah, it's probably. Yeah, my personal thoughts on that are probably that it's unhelpful to teach your kids that, to play into that false game about Santa Claus. I would teach them about St. Nicholas. I would teach them about Christ. I would teach them about the feast. There's so much joy and excitement to be had surrounding that period of time without necessarily going into great depths in sort of indulging the caricature of St. Nicholas, because Santa Claus is a caricature of St. Nicholas, or if you're Greek, Agi Vasili, which is a caricature of St. Basil the Great, right? So I would, as much as possible, kind of avoid that. I can't speak as a general rule to sort of, like, that is my sort of general two thoughts. Given the pastoral realities that people have to live with, is that always the best decision? Well, they need to speak to their spiritual fathers about that and kind of play it out. Depends on the child, depends on the context, you know. But I would say we ought to, as much as possible, steer away from that. Why do we have to take secular holidays when we already have all of these beautiful Orthodox holidays? And why do we have to infuse joy into something that when they're 11 and 12 years old, guess what? You're going to crush their dreams, because suddenly this is all fake. And on the one hand, I tell you forever, God is real. Jesus is real. The saints are real. The Mother of God hears us. Jesus hears us. He loves us. And Santa Claus hears us, and he watches us when we're sleeping, and he knows when we're bad or good. And then I turn around and say, okay, now you're old enough to know that's all fake. Well, but this stuff over here, no, this is still real. Yeah. This invisible guy over here, God and Jesus, yeah, they're still real. But this invisible guy over here, he's fake. Now, again, these are just some of the problems we need to consider when we approach this. I'm not saying we still shouldn't, you know, be a part of that. But what I am saying is these are the things as parents we need to be thinking about, as Sunday school teachers, as, you know, people interacting, because, you know, they have repercussions. It just doesn't matter. That's, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. We can't just say it doesn't matter. We need to wrestle with it. Other questions?
Good evening, Father. Your blessing.
Lord bless you.
You spoke about the evil one being the father of lies, and lie being synonymous with falsehood. We know that some of the greatest lies that separate man from God is heresy. Maybe that could be a fourth category, and the greatest of lies. Maybe can you talk to us about heresy, what it does to man, how it prohibits us from coming close to God and salvation? Maybe a few words about Saint Euphemia and the heresy of the anti-Chalcedonians, because of the day today.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. He does mention heresy in particular in the work towards the end, when he's talking about lying in our whole lives, and he talks about the devil masquerading as an angel of light. He says, no evil, no heresy, not even the devil himself can mislead someone unless it is transformed into virtue. And so he does mention heresy, because a person who accepts heresy doesn't accept it because he believes it's false, right? Not usually, unless you're the originator, you know, you've designed it, you're making it up, you know. Debatable, those people are conscious. But other people, they're deceived by something they believe is good, right? And they follow, for whatever reasons, they fall into these false teachings, these quote unquote angels of virtue that they think are there, when in reality it's the devil standing behind that. And this happens on lots of different levels, right? Sure, we can, strictly speaking, when we talk about heresy, we mean, errors in our thinking about divine things, generally speaking, or, about God, or errors in thinking about what it is to be a human being, or errors in thinking about the church, okay? Mainly errors, dogmatic errors, right? But, a lot of heresy not just also, because the way we think isn't unrelated to how we act, whether we want it to be or not. How you think will definitely affect how you act, and how you act will, unfortunately, transform the way you think. And so we could speak in a lesser sense of heresies of action, and in terms of our activities, which eventually will end up poisoning the way we think as well. And so we won't be able to sort of escape that. So, one of the best ways, again, remember we said one of the things about lying, one of the roots of this evil is a desire for pleasure. Well, it's very possible, for example, when we have a strong desire, for example, we want to be with someone, right? But guess what? We're already married, and the person we suddenly want to be with isn't our wife or our husband. Okay? This is going to be a sinful situation no matter how you cut it, right? But what happens is, because there's this strong pleasure for this other person, this strong desire, I've seen it happen where slowly a person begins lying to themselves because they desire this pleasure. They start changing their behavior so that they start to then change their thinking, and suddenly, when they in the beginning knew adultery was wrong, leaving your wife or husband for another person is wrong, they suddenly have come to the point, because they've been believing this lie that's attached to pleasure, that, well, actually, this is a good thing for me. This is what I should do. And my marriage isn't happy. And it would be better for my kids if I separated from my wife. And all these different kinds of lies that we end up telling ourselves. And where we began in the beginning, in a certain way, it would have been better if you had just committed adultery. Because at least then you'd have the chance of repentance. Because you'd know that what you did was wrong. But what can often happen is, by lying in our actions to ourselves for pleasure, we end up changing the way we think. So now we say, well, actually, divorce isn't a problem. And, getting married to this other person isn't a problem. And it was actually God's will. God forbid we should say such a thing. Right? This is how heresy works too. It just begins either with our thinking or with our actions, and we let it go, and then it turns into this. Another aspect of heresy that we said, what is the first cause of lying to ourselves? Or first cause of lying, the first root, is not being willing to blame ourselves and to be humiliated or to be put lower. So what happens? Well, we have a theological conflict about something. And I don't like to be proven wrong. So when you demonstrate that I'm wrong, my response is not to let myself be a little bit humbled and feel embarrassed, but be corrected and feel like I've returned to the truth. Rather, I lack that humility. I puff myself up and I say, no, my argument's still better than yours, and I'm not going to listen to you. And this is also how heresy begins. And this is how it begins when we look in the church councils. When we have groups of people, despite the fact that, the church has spoken, that these people, a group of people aren't willing to accept that and depart from that. And so this is the case, in the case of Saint Euphemia herself, it wasn't within her life. I mean, she reposed in 304. She was a martyr. But, we also commemorate a miracle that's connected with her life, that's connected with the Council of Chalcedon in 451, where we have this schism between, what historically the church calls monophysites versus Orthodox. Which today is called under various kinds of names, but it's what we would sort of say Oriental Orthodox or non-Chalcedonians or, Miaphysite you'd hear sometimes. And yes, connected to that miracle, this would be again an issue of hardness of heart. So the miracle is they had the two tomes, the Orthodox definition and the Monophysite definition. Basically, the Orthodox definition says Christ is perfect God and perfect man in one person, Jesus Christ, and that those human and divine natures aren't mingled to create something new. Whereas in the Miaphysite, I'm giving a sort of a gross oversimplification, they speak about there being one united or new nature that is both divine and human in the person of Christ. But from the Orthodox perspective, it blurs the lines, and it's neither human nor is it divine. It's something new entirely, and that's the problem there. So what happened with the miracle? They had a council. They couldn't decide. They say, let's take the two different definitions. They put it in the tomb of Saint Euphemia, right? And they say, let's fast and pray for 3 days. Let's seal up her tomb in Constantinople. And what do? They fast, they pray. When it opens up, what do they find? Despite the fact that they put the two scrolls on her chest, or in there with her, I can't remember exactly, on her chest, in her hand, she's holding the Orthodox one, and under her feet is the definition of the Monophysite one, or the Oriental one, or however we want to kind of call it. And so this is the sort of triumph of that. But what happens out of a lack of humility? The miracle isn't received. And to this point today, the miracle is now denied, right? Amongst those that are non-Orthodox, they just say, well, that miracle never happened. right? And but the other point I should make is that those that claim to be Miaphysite or Oriental would say to you today, well, we're not those kind of monophysites that they were talking about. And they're right, they're not Eutychian monophysites, but they still don't accept Chalcedon and all these councils afterwards. So, and their own definitions are still, according to teachers like St. John Damascus and later fathers right into contemporary times, like St. Paisius the New, who we just canonized, they are still guilty of this heresy of confusing the two natures, the divine and human, within Christ. Sorry, that's the most succinct version that I can probably give of that. So hopefully that kind of answers both the heresy bit and how it connects to lies, and gives you a little taste of Saint Euphemia. Other questions, anyone? Very good. Good. Well, we can wrap it up there then. Christ, the true light, who dost enlighten and sanctify every man that cometh into the world, let the light of thy countenance be signed upon us, that in it we may see the unapproachable light, and guide our steps in the performance of thy commandments. By the intercessions of thine all immaculate Mother, and of all thy saints, especially our Father among the saints, Abba Dorotheos of Gaza. Amen.
Thank you. Good night, Father.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.